And that's what we'll do, especially because Torah will endure when all the issues of the moment fade away, as inevitably happens and has happened now for millennia. So there, with that pitch, if you recall, those of you who were in last week's Torah class, we talked about Abraham's mission, Abraham and Sarah's mission, the initial call, and what all of that meant to the sort of broad architecture of the Torah and its story. And this morning, even though it is certainly true that the principal events of this parsha, the two principal events, are the destruction of Sodom and then the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Although I have talked about both in the Torah class in the past, this morning I'm going to do something different. I'm going to talk about a different story, and that is the story about Lot and Lot's daughters. And those of you who have the Torah in front of you, we're talking about chapter 19. Now, let me just give chapter 19 in the book of Genesis, that is. Let me give you the context for this. It is, if you recall, right after Abraham has the discussion with God about the destruction of Sodom, in which Abraham says, well, what if there are 50 righteous people there, and gets God down to 10, and utters the very memorable line, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, will the judge of all the earth not do justice, calling God to account for God's own standards, a remarkable moment in the development of human morality. And at that point, it's clear that after God says, I won't destroy the city for the sake of 10, God and Abraham part, so to speak, again, metaphorically speaking. It's not like, God picks up his walking stick and goes off, but God and Abraham part. And then you get to chapter 19. You're welcome to look at your at whatever translation you have, and I will read you the JPS translation. The two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, Lot, remember, is Abraham's brother's son, so he is his nephew. And at a certain point, this is something actually that I made reference to in the sermon, and will be coming in the Off the Pulpit this week. Those of you that subscribe to the weekly Off the Pulpit, at a certain point, Lot and Abraham's, both of whom had herds and cattle and so on. At a certain point, the two of them part because it becomes clear that their workers, so to speak, can't survive together. And there's quarreling. So Abraham says, okay, you go north, I'll go south, you go east, I'll go west. Abraham gives up on his own right of priority and lets Lot take whatever is good. A model of selflessness that is beautiful and too infrequently imitated in our day, probably then too. Anyway, here is where we learn Lot ends up in Sodom. And where you live says a lot about who you are, right? One of the first questions we ask people is, where are you from? And even if it is partly prejudicial, we do make assumptions about people or connections to people, or feel we know something about somebody if we learn where they came from. I will often have the experience of people saying, oh, you grew up in the East, as though that explains something about my character. Had I grown up in Los Angeles, I would have been different. And that may be true. But Lot chooses, of all the places that he could live, to go to Sodom. And one of the things that we know about Sodom is it's not such a good place. And presumably, Lot is drawn there by something about the city that he finds exciting or interesting. And this will play in to the story that we are about to read about Lot, because it seems like he was influenced by his neighborhood. So he's sitting in the gate of Sodom. And remember, the gate is both where the eminences of the city tend to sit, and it is also where you get the most traffic in and out. But generally it's associated with people who are important sit in the gate of the city. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet, that you may be on your way early." Now, this so far is entirely to Lot's credit, because hospitality, which is something that we have now grown to associate with Abraham and Sarah, and is, as you may know, a great value in Middle Eastern cultures. Hospitality is what Lot is demonstrating to two people whom he knows to be strangers. Now, how does he know them to be strangers? This has to do with the difference between life in the ancient world and life today. Even cities were very small, and everyone knew everyone. And people who were not from the city were clearly identifiable as such. That's why a literary critic once said there are two kinds of plots. One is a man goes on a journey, whether that's spiritual or metaphysical, man or woman, obviously. Sometimes a dog goes on a journey. If you ever read Albert Pace and Terhu or Lassie, but some kind of journey. And the other plot is a stranger comes to town. Now, a stranger comes to town doesn't work in Los Angeles, but it does work in Sodom. It does work in ancient cities where a stranger was clearly different and identifiable, and everyone knew, like in old Westerns, when a stranger shows up, everyone knows. So Lot invites them to his house because they're strangers in the city, obviously does not know that they're angels, and says then, "Please, my lords, turn aside." And they do. And therefore, Lot is able to bring them to his home. At least he thinks he will. But they refuse. They say, "No, we'll spend the night in the square," which sounds like they're going to be relatively homeless or exposed to the elements if they spend the night in the square, which was probably, again, not an unusual occurrence in the ancient world. After all, didn't have that many hotels and motels. But he urged them strongly, so they turned his way and entered his house. Now, the fact that he urged them strongly, again, is entirely to his credit. And you do feel like his time with Abraham, and maybe his similar upbringing to Abraham and Abraham's brother's house, has taught him the value of greeting people and bringing them in. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Okay, by the way, you'll notice the appearance there of unleavened bread. It does say matzot. Now, why would he make them matzahs and not bread? Remember why matzahs are made, because people don't have that much time. So if they came late in the afternoon, he doesn't have a lot of time to bake bread, because really people only have time to bake bread in a pandemic. But in normal life, they don't have time to bake bread. They would just make matzahs, and he would have matzahs as a sort of abbreviated snack for them. Okay. They had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, everyone in Sodom, young and old, gathered about the house. Now, Again, I remind you, when it says all the people of Sodom, we are not talking about throngs of millions, right? We are talking about a relatively small crowd by modern standards, because it's a relatively small city and it's all the men, young and old. They want to know about these strangers. And their intentions are obviously not good intentions. And now we start to understand perhaps why Lot insisted that they come to his house. Because if this is the character of the people of Sodom, and we know this from the previous story, right? All ties together. In chapter 18, God has already told Abraham the people of Sodom are no good. And now they're gathering around the house. Now we understand why Lot wanted to bring them into the house. Because had he left them outside, of people whom he knows are not going to be kind to them. So he brings them in. He did not obviously anticipate the reaction, which is not good. And they shouted to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them to us." Well, I will tell you how it that we may be intimate with them is the way that it is translated in my v'ned'a otam, and know them. And as you may know, to know someone in biblical parlance is intercourse. But clearly, what is being suggested here is a crowd does not gather outside someone's house to make tender love to the strangers who happen to be within, right? There is a reason why sodomy, coming from Sodom, is the English word for anal intercourse, because that clearly seems to be what the crowd is insisting that they be given leave to do, and it's clear that they are going to badly abuse, maybe end up killing the guests, who now are Lot's responsibility because he has taken them into his house. Now, what do you do? What do you do? There's no police force. Can't call 911. You got the entire city out there, all the men, insisting that you should give them the people in your home. I pause for coffee and dramatic effect. I don't think that you would choose what Lot does, but an unsolvable dilemma when he made the gesture to bring these strangers in, which was obviously a good impulse, but it has led, as good impulses sometimes do, to an impossible situation. Lot went out to them, to the entrance, and shut the door behind him. So he first puts himself on the line and closes the door behind him, which again, you have to admire. So far, Lot has acted very well. And said, "I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong." Can't do better than that. He's begging them, don't do this terrible thing. And up to now, up to this point, if the story ended here, we would totally be on Lot's team and think, good man, this Lot. And I will cast in my lot with him. Sorry, I can't. I know, but you do realize that I can't even hear your groans, so I just have to imagine them. But then he goes on to say, look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. I have 2 virgin daughters. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please, but don't do anything to these men, since they've come under the shelter of my roof. Now, there are so many things to think about this. One is, and let's not fool ourselves, it says a great deal about the relative position of men and women in the ancient world and throughout much of the world even today. That is, I have strangers here and I value them less than my daughters. If Lot had 2 sons, we might wonder that he would be reluctant to offer his sons on the altar of the stranger's abuse, but he does not hesitate to offer his daughters. And this again says something about the neighborhood that Lot has chosen. It doesn't say that he's an entirely bad man or he wouldn't have gotten himself into this situation in the first place. But it does say that he has lost his moral compass in a significant sense and is unable to withstand the pressure of their crowding around his house without an act of desperation that is also a terrible act of betrayal and cruelty. To offer his daughters to the crowd and say to them, you can do with them what you want. But they said, stand back. The fellow, they said, came here as an alien and already he acts the ruler. Now we will deal with you worse than with them. So the fact that Lot has offered his daughters cuts no ice, so to speak, with the men of Sodom, and in fact enrages them because he's suggesting depriving them of what they insist on having, of what they want. And so they said, now we're going to give it to you even worse than we were going to give it to them. And again, you understand that the impulse here is cruelty and pain, not so much sexuality. The impulse here, this is as the old saw has it, it's not about sex, about power. And they're asserting their power over Lot, that he came there, did not grow up in Sodom, didn't go to the local Sodom day school, and now he is telling them how they should act, and it infuriates them. Because as you know, bad people especially don't like to be told how to act. One of the characteristics of goodness is that it can hear criticism. One of the frequent characteristics of cruelty and evil is that criticism makes it more cruel and more evil. And they pressed hard against the person of Lot and moved forward to break the door. So things are reaching a point at which Lot and everybody in the house, the strangers, the daughters, are going to be overrun and cruelly used. And this is an illustration right after God and Abraham were talking of the fact that there are no righteous people. Remember, everyone in the town gathered there, at least all the men. Again, question about how the women would have acted is an interesting question. It says Anshe Sodom, though, Nar ad Zaken, from young to old. Anyway, but the men stretched out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. So the strangers managed somehow to get Lot inside and to close the door. But if you're reading the story for the first time, you're still going to assume that the strangers are going to break their way in, although we know the people of Sodom are going to break their way in, but we know, of course, that the strangers are angels, and that throws some uncertainty into the mix. What can angels do? That we don't know. We're about to find out. And the people who were at the entrance of the house, young and old, were struck with blinding light, so they were helpless to find the entrance. This is an interesting angelic resource. What is it that angels can do? They can cast a light that is so bright that it is blinding. And so you can't see what it is that the entrance of the door, excuse me, you can't see the entrance of the door, and therefore all of the people of the city are momentarily disabled. In other words, the strangers have saved Lot. Then the men said to Lot, "Whom else do you have here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone else, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place. For the outcry against them before the Lord has become so great that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So we know that they were sent to destroy it even before this happened. And this is a confirmation of the horrors that God has already spoken about the city of Sodom. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons who'd married his sons-in-law had married his daughters, and said, "Up out of this place, the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his son-in-law as one who jests. Kid said, "Come on, destroy the city? What are you, crazy? People don't destroy cities." And also, you can understand why that would seem to be a very improbable result. When dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two remaining daughters, lest you be swept away in the iniquity of the city." In other words, the sons and the daughters, the sons-in-law and the daughters, they're going to be taken because they didn't believe it. But Lot and his two daughters and his wife will escape. And it is what happens after they escape that we want to focus on a bit. Still he delayed, so the men seized his hand, the hands of his wife and his two daughters, the Lord's mercy on them, and brought them out and left them outside the city. And then they said, "Flee for your life, don't look behind you, or stop anywhere on the plain, flee to the hills, lest you be swept away." Now, they're telling Lot to run, and they're telling him to run now, or he's going to be swept away. So what do you do if you're Lot? Well, here's where we see a different side of Lot. Already, we know that Lot is not a completely pure ethical character. How do we know this? We know it, first of all, from the previous story where Abraham said, "You take whatever land you want, and I'll take whatever remains." And Lot does not say back to him, no, Abraham, you take the good land. After all, you brought me here. No, Lot takes the land he wants. So we know already that Lot has a slightly grasping character, even though he has good impulses, because people are complicated. They're not black or white. They're not good or bad. Everybody has lots of conflicting impulses. Everybody. There is no person who is entirely one thing. And Lot is complicated, and he brought the strangers into his home, and yet he always has his eye out for the main chance. Because after they tell him to run away, what does Lot say? Instead of saying, "Okay, everybody run," no, he says, "Oh, my Lord, you've been so gracious to your servant and shown me such kindness in order to save my life. But I can't flee to the hills lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Look, that town there is nice enough. It's such a little place. Let me flee there, such a little place, and let my life be saved." In other words, I spotted a nice piece of real estate. Let me, instead of just running, how about if I settle there? I'll build a nice little house, right? I'll picket fence. I will string up some Hanukkah lights, even though this is thousands of years before Hanukkah. And I will live there and have a good life. And even in the midst of such a crisis, even in the midst of the city about to be destroyed, Lot still has an eye for real estate, just like he did in the previous chapter. It's very interesting how sometimes there are deep structures in people that are consistent and do not change, and Lot's does not change. So they say to him, "Okay, take it. We will do this favor for you as well." And remember, when they say "we will do this favor for you as well," the Hebrew word for angel is malach. Malach means messenger. The angels are not exercising independent will here. They're obviously speaking in the name of God. God's saying, "Okay, you want that little town? I'll give you the little town. You slightly ungrateful Schmendrick, I will give you that town, but those are my words, not God's. I'm just reading into God's attitude here. I will give you that little town, go, stay. And so I will not annihilate the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, flee there, for I can't do anything till you arrive there. In other words, I'm not going to destroy it until you get there. And he went to a place called Zoar. As the sun rose upon the earth and Lot entered Zoar, the Lord rained down sulfurous fire out of heaven, annihilated those cities and all the inhabitants. And Lot's wife looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. Now, there is a good bit to say about that, but I'm going to move through that fairly quickly because I really want to talk about Lot's daughters. Why does she look back? It is a deeply human impulse. First of all, you hear behind you destruction. It's like a nuclear bomb going off. Who wouldn't look behind you? Except that she's instructed not to. But also, it is a metaphor, clearly a metaphor. Just as a pillar of salt is a metaphor for tears, and the regret that people feel about their past, and the sadness that people feel about their past, and the difficulty of leaving the past behind, all of that is wrapped up in this image of a pillar of salt. But the ethical implication here, and the reason why destruction falls upon her, is because there is a sense in which it's clear that she misses the life that she is leaving behind. And because it was so cruel, because it was a city of ethical depravity or unethical depravity, Lot's wife's looking back is an action that in and of itself condemns her. So, at least according to the commentators. She's turned into a pillar of salt. Then the next morning, Abraham, in this really magnificent descriptive scene, Abraham hurries to the place where he stood before the Lord, and looking down to Sodom and Gomorrah and all the lands of the plain, he saw the smoke of the land rising like the smoke of a kiln. Okay? So everything is destroyed, and all that is left is a smoldering ruin from two towns. And you have to feel at the moment that Abraham must have this sense of, I couldn't save it. I tried, and I did not succeed in saving the town. There is more to unpack there, but I want to get to one other scene for reasons that I hope will become clear. Lot went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country with 2 daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, because after he actually saw the destruction, he didn't want to get that close. He thought he did, but then... And he and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. Now imagine the psychology here, right? Everything they know has been destroyed, and they're afraid to live outside in the world because it has rained fire from the sky. So he goes and he lives in a cave. And the older said to the younger, our father is old, and there isn't a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine and lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father, and he didn't know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day the older one said to the younger, see, I lay with father last night. Let's make him drink wine again tonight, and you go lay with him, that we may maintain life through our father. That night they made their father drink wine, and the younger went in and lay with him, and he didn't know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus the 2 daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. The older one bore a son and named him Moab, father of the Moabites to today, and the younger bore a son and named him Ben-Ami. He's the father of Ammonites till today. Okay. The first thing I want to say is, you may know that the Ammonites and the Moabites were enemies of Israel. And boy, if you want to make your enemies upset, you give them an origin that is incestuous, right? You can just imagine how the Ammonites and the Moabites felt about the story of their origin in Hebrew scriptures. But also, I want you to remember that that later on, the Torah says that the Ammonites and the Moabites can't come into the congregation of Israel. But there is a Moabite who comes into the congregation of Israel, and that is Ruth. Ruth is from Moab. She is a Moabite, or more accurately, as the Talmud points out, she is a Moabitess. Maybe that's why she's allowed, because she's not a Moabite, but a female Moabite. But remember that, because we're going to come back to it in just a second. The Talmud actually does not condemn the daughters of Lot. It says that their impulses were good. They wanted to repopulate the world, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And they were understandably deceived about the reality of other people living in the world. They thought they were the only ones. That was obviously not the case, but they didn't know that. And they were in a cave alone with their father. Lot, well, I suppose if you saw cities get destroyed, getting drunk is not such a bad reaction, not such an unusual reaction. It's funny that they cultivated wine first. They cultivated grapes before almost anything else. But maybe that is, I suppose, in a time of pandemic, people drink more. And this was like a pandemic on an almost unimaginable scale. But here is the most peculiar, interesting, fascinating, gripping, remarkable thing about this story, which is the line of Moab that leads to Ruth, leads to David, right? Because Ruth is the ancestress of David. And the line of Boaz, Ruth and Boaz, goes back to Judah. And David's line, Boaz and Ruth, by the way, produce the child that leads to David. Judah and Tamar lead the child that produce Peretz, who leads to Boaz. And David is the ancestor of the Messiah. Judah and Tamar, if you remember, Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law. And Ruth is not Jewish. So the ancestor of the Messiah comes from incest, Lot and his daughters, near incest, Judah and his daughter-in-law, right, who's no longer married. It's not adultery, but it's incest. Adultery, David and Bathsheba. And then the Messiah. So it's incest, adultery, near adultery, and the Messiah. This is the deep structure now of the Torah's story. And what is it trying to tell us here? Right? What's it trying to tell us? And it's interesting, by the way, that this is Lot who is the ancestor of Moab, and then of Ruth, and then of David. It's trying to say, I think, that the notions we have of heroism and purity and perfection are not and can never be true in human society or in the human heart. And there are extremes at each end. That is, Sodom is the extreme. It is so bad, it cannot be allowed to continue. And there are extremes of goodness, although never perfection, not in the Hebrew Bible. Moshe might be an extreme of goodness, but is he perfect? Clearly not. Abraham might be an extreme of goodness. Is he perfect? Clearly not. But within those two outsized brackets, all human beings, even the ones who have the privilege of being the forerunners of the Messiah, all of them have deep flaws, not little, not, I sometimes, forget to turn off the tap while I'm brushing my teeth and waste water. Not little flaws, but deep flaws, enduring flaws. Like, look, Lot is a very problematic character. His daughters, even if their intentions are good, surely ethically, this is a very problematic act. And it comes out of a background of living among cruel and terrible people. And that was Lot's choice. He didn't have to live in Sodom. There was a lot of nice property in other cities, I assume. I haven't done a lot of ancient real estate surveying, but there had to be. I mean, it was the ancient world. There's a lot of land, a lot of places. But he chose to live in Sodom because he himself has this ethical questionableness. And yet, God can use all sorts of tools. All sorts. You read the book of Judges and you see one after another is ethically very questionable. And yet, some of them deliver Israel. And this realization ought to take a little bit of the edge off of our judgmentalism. When you read in the paper about someone in whatever field caught in a scandal or who did a bad thing or so on, you feel a sort of salacious joy. I understand that that's human. It's not admirable, but it's human. But the surprise that we feel tells us that we haven't read our Bibles very well. Just look in the Torah. Look what happens with Lot and his daughters. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on it is because people don't pay as much attention sometimes to those stories, but they are in their way as important as the better known stories of the Akedah or the destruction of Sodom. The story of Lot and his daughters is profound and matters tremendously in the future of the Jewish people and of the world. And yet it is a story filled with ethical sludge and with deep questions about human nature. And remember that the only reason it happens is because the mother looks back and gets turned into a pillar of salt. If she had been more consistent, although her looking back again is psychologically extremely understandable, but if she had been more consistent, if she had been less willing to do that which she ought not to have done, then, then it is always possible that none of this would have happened, right? She would have been sleeping with Lot instead of the daughters. And it says a lot about the way in which the Torah tries to teach us, because it doesn't use judgmental terms. It doesn't say Lot sending his daughters out was bad. It doesn't say Lot sleeping with his daughters was bad. But it is interesting, the whole dynamic. Here, he doesn't think of them in any way. He just throws them out to the strangers, or is prepared to, and he sleeps with them without thinking of them in any way because he's so drunk. His obliviousness to their personhood exists all through the story and tells you something about Lot. This is the same person who unthinkingly took property from Abraham, unthinkingly said to the angels, I'd like that piece of property, and then is terrified and scares and gets drunk. So he doesn't have ethical strength. He might be a nice person, but maybe he's not a good person, because goodness takes ethical strength. Niceness is you're nice. But whatever the reality of Lot's story, what is clear is that without this story, or because of this story, you get the line that leads to the Messiah. Now, of course, not yet, because the Messiah is not here yet. But should the Messiah come, and should you happen to run across the Messiah, you can always say, oh, I know your ancestors. Iffy people, your ancestors, but I like you. Anyway, that's Torah for this Thursday morning. Now you can go back to watching the election that never ends, but it will end. And I'm sure it will end before we meet again next Thursday morning for Torah class. Also, please join me for Shabbat morning services, when I will be giving a sermon about whatever happens in the next day or two, in one way or another. In the meantime, stay well, stay safe, and read the rest of the Parsha. It's good too.